Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another little instalment of looking at 70s monster memories. um, you may be aware that 70s Monster Memories was the first book that We Belong Dead published quite a few years back now, and we reprinted it as well. But both of those editions are now completely sold out, unless you want to pay a ridiculous amount, like £500 on eBay, to a scalper. But what we've done is we've launched a digital version, so it's the entire book, 408 pages in full colour, and you can download it either on Amazon or on Apple. And I can post the links for that down below. So I want to talk today about, we've looked at various aspects, monster models and tie-in books and magazines. So I want to look at books today. Now, my good friend and co-editor Daryl has already done a little video talking about the Lorimer books, so do check that one out. So I'm going to talk about a few of the other books that made growing up in the 70s so magical and so wonderful. And the first one I want to talk about is this, Horrors from Screen to Scream by Ed Naha. This is actually the American version. The British copy was completely different cover, and it was one of the first books I got. My parents, bless them, did indulge me in my love of all things horror, and so they got me a copy of this book one Christmas. And for a 12-year-old, I was delighted. I mean, basically, it's an encyclopedic guide to the greatest horror and fantasy films of all time. So it's basically just an A to Z of different films and different people involved in making the films. So the book begins with the letter A, surprisingly. And the first entries are Abbott and Costello go to Mars, Abbott and Costello meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. And we go all the way through to Z. And what do we have for Z? We have Zardoz, the Zombies of Moritor, Zombies of the Stratosphere, Zombies on Broadway, Zots, which is a very obscure William Castle film, and George Zucker. Because I also looked at actors and directors as well. And this is a wonderful book. We have a whole chapter on this book and on Ed Naha, who was actually interviewed for the chapter on this book in our 70s Monster Memories. Next up, I remember being about 10 or 11 and seeing King Kong, the original 1933 classic, on TV, and just like many before me, falling in love with the great beast. So imagine my delight in the 70s when this appeared in the bookshop, The Making of King Kong. And what a beautiful cover as well. And this is pretty much everything you ever need to know about King Kong, behind the scenes, the people who made the movie. Absolutely fascinating. It was in here, actually, I first heard about the fabled missing spider pit sequence. And again, this is a wonderful book, wonderful cover. Now, you know, when I was a kid, I would take the train, 20-minute train, to a local town which was called Darlington in County Durham. And I would read about these books in magazines such as The World of Horror or The House of Hammer. And the only way I could get these books was to go to my local bookstore, which was called Dressers, and I would put the order in there. And you know, these days it's so easy, isn't it? You just click the mouse, you can order something, it'll be there in a couple of days. But in those days, you had to go to the bookshop, you put your order in, you paid for it, and then you'd have to wait 2-3 weeks sometimes. And when the book finally came in, they would give you a phone call, and it would be so exciting. You know, I would get the phone call on a Tuesday, but I knew I wasn't going to the town until the Saturday. So those days were just excruciating waiting. But the wait was well worth it, because you would get there and you'd get the new book that you'd ordered. And one of those books was this one, Horror in the Cinema by Ivan Butler. I love the front cover of this, and back cover there from Dance of the Vampires. Very strange format for a book, very small, and but again heavily illustrated. And this was a great book because this was a bit more in depth, talking about the movies and taking them quite seriously. You know, not really like things like Famous Monsters of Filmland, which were very, very jokey. So this was a lot more serious and a lot more in depth. And I loved it. One of the things I loved about these kind of books that I would get as a kid is this one, for example, at the back, it has a listing of genre films. Starts in 1908 with Selig Polyscope production of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and then it has the Frankenstein 1910, the Edison Frankenstein, which you can now see on YouTube, I believe. And it goes all the way up to then current, and this was written in 1969. So we have I Have the Cat and Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. So one of the things I loved as a kid, though, is you'd have these lists, and I would go through and I would tick the ones that I'd seen, which were not that many really, because unlike in the US, we weren't allowed to see them at the cinema. These were all X certificates. You had to be 18 or over. So the only time we get to see some of these movies was on the TV, late night showings on the TV. But a very good book. Even now, I'd highly recommend this one, Horror in the Cinema. Now, talking of serious books, perhaps the most serious, and serious doesn't mean boring, by the way, but this is a wonderful book by the writer David Perry, A Heritage of Horror. And I've had this ever since I was about 13 years old. As a 13-year-old, it was a lot of this, to be honest, was kind of over my head. I didn't really understand a lot of what he was saying, but basically he makes a link between English Gothic literature, and he goes all the way back to Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley, and that trend in Gothic literature that the English and the Irish and the Scots were so good at. And he connects that to the then current resurgence of a horror movie in England. And I love this, just, for the illustrations again, incredible. And I learned about a lot of films I knew nothing about up until this point. And again, with this one, it's great. It's got a little thing at the back, a filmography. And, I could only dream of seeing a lot of these movies. Even all these years later, 40 odd years later, whatever it is, this is a book well worth owning. It's an absolutely fantastic book. And David Perry actually he did a rewrite, a revised edition, which came out a few years ago. I'll be honest with you, I didn't really like that revised edition at all. And I would say that if you're going to buy Heritage of Horror, buy the original release. This lovely edition here. Somebody else who took things seriously was the writer John Brosnan. He did a number of books, and a regular contributor to magazines like The House of Hammer. And this was his book, The Horror People. And this is a fantastic book, actually. It has chapters on... so basically it looks at people both in front of the camera and behind the camera who made these genre movies. So, chapters on the Cheneys, Lugosi and Karloff. Then you have Carl Front, Todd Browning, James Whale, Val Lewton and company, Jack Arnold, Hammer Films, AIP, Roger Corman, William Castle, Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Writing Horror, Richard Matheson and Robert Bloch. I think this is the first time I ever heard of these two guys, and then I frantically tried to find lots of paperback editions of their writings. Directing horror, they have Freddie Francis and Roy Baker, and producing horror, Milton Subotsky and Kevin Francis. Again, some great behind-the-scenes stuff, including photographs, and just fascinating. I had no idea who Val Lewton was. I don't think I even knew who James Whale or Todd Browning were. I knew Lugosi and Karloff and the people in front of the camera. And again, even now, all these years later, this is a fantastic book, and I'm sure you can find this fairly cheap on somewhere like eBay. Now we come to the more visual ones, because as teenagers, that's the things we wanted, was the visuals. And I already mentioned David Perry's Heritage of Horror, which is fantastic, but he also did this wonderful book, The Vampire Cinema, and what a fantastic cover. Now, as a teenager, this book was fascinating for me because whole sections on foreign vampire movies. I was aware of the Hammer Draculas, of course, and there's a whole chapter on the Hammer Draculas. There's a chapter on the Universal and the vampire films of the 30s and 40s. But then is where it gets interesting, because and each chapter heading is a quote from Bram Stoker's original novel. So we have here the sex vampire, and this was kind of forbidden fruit as a teenager. But this is my first encounter with the works of Jean Rollin, and I've become a huge fan over the years. I love his stuff, but particularly I love his vampire movies. Le Lèvres de Sang, Lips of Blood is probably my favourite of all Rollin's films. And these films fascinated me just looking at the images. I mean, I never thought I'd ever get to see these movies, but I was captivated by the images of these movies. Also, this movie I first discovered in this book, Daughters of Darkness. Uh, Wonderful atmospheric vampire movie. And so it looks at French vampire movies, it looks at Italian, Mexican, Spanish, and just so many. And at the new American Vampire, it has a whole chapter on that, the grim and grisly ranks of the undead. And this is where he looked at things like Count Yorga Vampire and Blackula, House of Dark Shadows, all this kind of stuff. And fascinating stuff for a teenager who never dreamed that one day not only would he see these movies, but actually own most of them on shiny DVD and Blu-ray discs. But again, fantastic book. It's very well written as well. It's not just the visuals, but it's very, very well written. A very good study, in-depth study of vampire cinema up to the 1970s. So again, highly recommended. Now, when you talk to people of a certain age who grew up in the 70s, the two names that spring to mind, of course, are Alan Frank and Dennis Giffords. And the first Alan Frank book I ever got was this movie Treasury. It's a bit tattered and torn now, but it's been with me for years. And I love the cover. I mean, normally I'm a big fan of painted covers, but I love the simplicity of this cover. In fact, when we reprinted the 70s Monster Memories in the second edition, my good friend, the artist Dave Brooks, used this as the main image for his painting for the revised edition of 70s Monster Memories. But again, it was all about the visuals. And come on, you can't go wrong. If you have a book and you open it and the first thing you see is a photograph of Trog, then it's an essential buy in my books. But this is great. But again, it's kind of it's all about the visuals in the Alan Frank books, isn't it? And I would pore over these photographs and think, never dreaming I'd get to see these movies. I mean, some of them came onto TV. Many of them were a bit too obscure or a bit too recent to be able to see. And the interesting thing is, I'm one of the people who was involved in the launching of the Slaughter Awards, which we give to people every year, along with Dark Side magazine. And one of the first recipients of that was Alan Frank himself. And I think he was a bit taken aback to come to the Dark Fest and to get this award, but then to see the huge love and affection so many fans still hold for him, because it was down to him and Dennis Gifford really that most of us got into our love of the genre. And I remember when I was putting together the 70s Monster Memory books, we were lucky enough to have Des Skin do the foreword, and I managed to get a contact number for Alan Frank, so I really wanted him to do the afterword. But he'd had such a huge influence on my childhood. I was so nervous about calling him up. But he couldn't have been nicer. And we were on the phone for about an hour. He had so many stories to tell. And he followed this up with a book called Monsters and Vampires, with a great cover photograph of Christopher Lee being staked in Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. And then a huge format film, I think it's just called Horror Films or Horror Movies. But they're all kind of very, very similar. But this is the one I have fondest memories of. Which brings me to the very final one, the Bible. The Bible itself. Dennis Gifford's Pictorial History of the Horror Movies. Now, I bought this in the Isle of Wight. We'd gone there on our summer holidays. And it was Sunday. My mum had took us to church. And on the way back from church to the hotel we were staying in, we walked past a bookshop. And in the window was this. And I was captivated. I wanted this book. And I had to wait till the next day when the shop was open, and I took my money out of my post office savings account, and I rushed to buy this. I think it was £1.95 when I bought it new. And it's just wonderful. I mean, just look at that wonderful cover by Tom Chantrell, who did many of the Hammer film posters. Our next book, which is a spotlight on horror, we have the wonderful Graham Humphreys has done a cover painting for that. And it's very much influenced by Tom Chantrell's cover for the Gifford book. But this is the Bible. Now I know he gets a lot of stick because a lot of people say, you know, he really gave Hammer films a very hard time, and it's true. He doesn't have a lot to say about Hammer, but it was in the pages of this book that I first saw all these photographs of Hammer films. That's when I first saw Cushing as Baron Frankenstein and Christopher Lee as Count Dracula. And I think, in his defence, I would have to say, when he was writing, these Hammer films were still current. They were new, you know, and he didn't really like the way things were going. Um, but you know, I mean, many years later, in the 90s, when it was all slasher and gore films, I felt the same about the new films that were coming out then, and I dismissed anything that was made after 1979. But over the years, my opinion has changed, and there's some great films in the 80s and the 90s, and even, you know, in the new century, lots of good films. So um, I think we shouldn't be too hard on him. But you know, it was in the pages of this book. I mean, I just, so many images. Even to this day, I watch a movie and I'll be like, ah, it's a Gifford image. You know, I recognise a scene that I first saw in this book. And you know, many of these films I thought I'm never going to see. Films like Equinox or Horrors of Malformed Men, The Silver-Haired Witch, Living Skeleton, especially the Japanese ones. You think, ah, well, I'm never going to see these movies. Now, of course, most of them you can get on DVD or Blu-ray or download. And same for a lot of the silent movies. Never thought I'd get to see very obscure films. And I think if you talk to anybody who had this book, there's certain images that people always discuss. For me, one of them was this one, this picture here, from 1948 film, The Fall of the House of Usher, and this captivated me. I mean, I was aware of the Corman Price House of Usher, and it was many years before I actually got to see this one. It's a very strange film actually, but well worth seeking out. The other one that everyone mentions, everyone remembers, is the famous photograph of the girl with the axe in her head. And again, this is from an cheap American movie called The Black Cat, from the 1960s, and 66 I think it was. I finally got to see this a few years ago, and it's a very cheap film, but it's just worth it for, and the actual scene is as brutal as it looks in this photograph here. So you know, it's you know, there's Christopher Lee dying as Dracula in two different films, and again, I hadn't really seen any of these movies, and now you know it's so easy because we have access to them at the click of a mouse. And a couple of years ago, we did this thing. I might actually rerun it, and it was about it was called the Gifford Challenge, and the challenge was to see as many movies featured in Gifford's book as you possibly could. And it's fun. It's a fun thing to do. But anyway, that was the first one I ever bought, and that set me off on a lifelong love of horror. So, if for no other reason, I have a lot. I owe a lot to Mr. Dennis Gifford, and I think for many people, we have a similar story to tell. And so, you know, please leave a comment. Let us know what was the first book that you got as a child, and what's your most, you know, your favourite book. I mean, these days there's so many wonderful books out there, but these are so full of nostalgia, and it takes you back to a simpler time, I think, really. And we have chapters on all these things in the 70s Monster Memories, and we also have a chapter looking at Dennis Gifford himself, and you know, we cover many things: Super 8 films, trading cards, monster model kits, and paperback tie-ins, every aspect of 70s Monster Memories you could imagine. So, as I say, that's now available digitally on both Amazon and on Apple. So do check that out, and we'll see you very soon.